Every Friday night in 1973, the Santa Cruz homicide detectives gathered at a bar called the Jury Room. They were exhausted, frustrated, and terrified. They were hunting a ghost monster known as the co-ed killer. To blow off steam, they drank with their favorite regular, a 6'9" giant they affectionately called Big Ed. He bought them rounds. He listened to their theories. He was their friend. What they didn't know was that the very man buying their beer had the severed head of a college student sitting in the trunk of his car, parked right outside the bar. To understand how a serial killer infiltrated the inner circle of the police department, you first have to understand the atmosphere of Santa Cruz in 1973. It was a terrifying time. College students were vanishing. Bodies were appearing in the mountains. The police were desperate for a break. Enter Edmund Kemper. At 6'9" and weighing nearly 300 pounds, he was a man you literally couldn't miss. But despite his intimidating size, he didn't strike anyone as dangerous. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and polite. In fact, Kemper's lifelong dream was to be a police officer. He desperately wanted to wear the badge. But there was one problem. He was too big. The state troopers rejected him because he couldn't physically fit inside their standard-issue patrol cars. That rejection stung, but it didn't stop him. If he couldn't be a cop, he would become the next best thing, a cop buff. He bought a Ford Galaxy, the exact make and model used by undercover detectives. He installed a police scanner in the dashboard. He wore heavy boots and mirrored sunglasses. He curated an image so perfect that when he walked into a room, people naturally assumed he was on the job. And that image was his golden ticket into the jury room, the favorite watering hole of the Santa Cruz police force. He wasn't an intruder. To them, he was a frustrated aspiring officer who just wanted to help. They saw a friendly giant. They had no idea they were inviting the wolf right into the sheep pen. In the early 1970s, Santa Cruz, California, was a city living in a state of suspended terror. It was a time of hitchhiking, free love, and coastal beauty, but beneath the surface, something rotten was festering. The community had been rocked by a series of inexplicable disappearances. Young college women, bright, hopeful, and innocent, were vanishing from bus stops and lonely highways, only to be found days later, discarded in the mountains like broken dolls. The press had already coined a name for the phantom stalking their streets, the co-ed killer. The police were under immense pressure. They were looking for a maniac. They profiled him as a drifter, perhaps a transient drug addict, or a rage-filled counterculture hippie who hated the establishment. They were looking for someone who looked like a monster, but they were looking in the wrong direction. While the city locked its doors and students walked in pairs, a man named Edmund Kemper was living openly among them. He didn't look like a shadow in the night. He was impossible to miss. Standing 6'9" and weighing nearly 300 pounds, Kemper was a physical anomaly, a giant of a man. Yet, despite his size, he projected an aura of gentle clumsiness. He was the guy who opened doors for little old ladies. He was the soft-spoken neighbor who waved hello. To the people of Santa Cruz, and specifically to the law enforcement officers struggling to solve these crimes, Big Ed was a fixture of the community. He wasn't the monster they were hunting. He was the friendly giant they stopped to chat with. The irony was absolute. The monster wasn't hiding in the dark. He was standing directly in the sun, casting a shadow over the very detectives sworn to catch him. To understand the deception, you have to understand Edmund Kemper's obsession. He didn't hate the police, he idolized them. Since he was a child, Kemper had fantasized about being a figure of authority. He craved the respect, the power, and the camaraderie that came with the badge. In his early 20s, he applied to become a state trooper, believing it was his destiny. But fate played a cruel joke. The very physical attribute that defined him, his massive size, was his undoing. He was rejected, not because of his psychological profile, but because he was simply too big to fit inside a standard-issue patrol car. Rejection devastated him, but it didn't stop him. If he couldn't be a cop officially, he would craft a persona that was indistinguishable from one. Kemper became what is known in law enforcement circles as a cop buff. He didn't just admire them, he mimicked them. He went to a dealership and purchased a 1969 Ford Galaxie 500. To the untrained eye, it was just a sedan. But to those in the know, it was the exact make and model used for unmarked police interceptors. He didn't stop at the car. He outfitted the vehicle with heavy-duty police tires and installed a high-frequency police scanner in the dashboard. He added 2 large antennas to the trunk and slapped a blue light sticker on the bumper, a sole signal to law enforcement that the driver was friendly. He cut his hair short, wore mirrored aviator sunglasses, and donned heavy work boots. When Edmund Kemper drove down the highway, traffic slowed down. People checked their speedometers. He looked like the law. He drove like the law. And for the terrified hitchhikers he picked up, he offered a false sense of safety that would prove fatal. Every detective squad has a sanctuary, a place to loosen the tie, unholster the weapon, and drink away the horrors of the day. In Santa Cruz, that place was a bar called the Jury Room. It was a dive bar, thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale beer, populated almost exclusively by off-duty cops. It was a closed circle, a fraternity where outsiders were usually ignored. But Edmund Kemper wasn't an outsider. He was Big Ed. Kemper had successfully infiltrated this inner circle not by force, but by servitude. He knew these men were underpaid and overworked, dealing with the most gruesome crime wave in the city's history. So, he became their benefactor. He would walk in, his head nearly scraping the doorframe, and immediately order a pitcher for the table. He bought them donuts. He listened to their gripes about the chief, their wives, and their castle oats. He was the perfect listener. The detectives, disarmed by his generosity and his pathetic eagerness to be liked, let their guard down completely. They viewed him as a harmless mascot, a gentle, simple-minded giant who just wanted to hang out with the cool kids. They teased him, nicknamed him, and slapped him on the back. While they analyzed the psychology of the co-ed killer, theorizing about his hatred for women and his elusive nature, the man himself was sitting on the bar stool next to them, sipping a beer and nodding in agreement. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Kemper wasn't just hiding in plain sight. He was hiding in the safest place in the city, surrounded by the police. The dichotomy of Edmund Kemper's life during this period is almost impossible to comprehend. By day or early evening, he was the jovial friend of the force. He was shaking hands with the sheriff and discussing traffic patterns. By night, he was a predator of unparalleled brutality. He used the trust he had built to facilitate his crimes. The cop buff persona wasn't just for his ego. It was a hunting tool. When he cruised the university campuses, young women didn't see a creep. They saw a clean-cut man in a car that looked official. They saw the sticker on the bumper. They saw the confidence. In an era where hitchhiking was common but increasingly dangerous, getting into Big Ed's car felt like the safe option. He used their trust and authority against them. After committing acts of unspeakable violence, dismembering bodies and discarding them in remote ravines, he would often drive straight back to the city. He would wash his hands, change his shirt, and head to the jury room. Imagine the adrenaline, the dark secret sitting in his gut as he walked through those doors. He would sit down, order a drink, and ask the detectives, "Any luck catching that guy yet?" He watched their frustration grow in real time. He fed off their confusion. For Kemper, this was the ultimate power trip. He was proving, night after night, that he was smarter than the collective force of the Santa Cruz Police Department. He was holding the city in terror with one hand and buying the police a round of drinks with the other. There is one specific moment in the Edmund Kemper saga that illustrates just how dangerously close he came to being caught and how his relationship with the police ultimately saved him. It is a moment that plays out like a scene from a scripted Hollywood thriller, yet it is entirely real. One night, Kemper was driving home after murdering 2 students, Anita Lucchesa and Marianne Pass. Their bodies were not buried in the woods. They were currently folded into the trunk of his Ford Galaxy. He was driving with the evidence of a double homicide directly behind him. Suddenly, red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. A patrolman signaled him to pull over. Kemper had a broken taillight. For any other killer, this would be the end. The smell of death, the nervousness, the potential for a search, it should have been over. Kemper pulled to the shoulder, his heart pounding against his ribs. The officer walked up to the window, flashlight in hand. But as the beam of light hit the driver's face, the officer's demeanor changed instantly. He didn't see a suspect. He saw Big Ed. He saw the guy from the bar. Instead of asking for a license or looking in the back seat, the officer smiled. He told Ed he needed to get that light fixed before he caused an accident. They exchanged a few friendly words, perhaps a joke about the late hour. The officer tapped the roof of the car and waved him on. Kemper drove away, sweating, with 2 bodies in the trunk, waved through a checkpoint by the very law enforcement agency hunting him. It was the ultimate testament to his camouflage. The relationship Kemper cultivated went beyond free drinks and friendly waves. It became a source of tactical intelligence. Because the detectives viewed him as a wannabe colleague, they often spoke freely in front of him about the investigation. They vented their frustrations about the lack of physical evidence, the dead-end leads, and most critically, their surveillance strategies. Kemper would sit at the bar, nursing a drink, while the detectives outlined exactly where they were setting up roadblocks. They told him which canyons they had already searched and which ones they were planning to search next week. They discussed the shifts of the patrol cars, when the roads would be swarming with cops and when they would be empty. Kemper absorbed every word. He wasn't just a passive listener. He was a spy in the war room. He used this information to adjust his hunting grounds. If he knew the police were focusing on the Highway 17 corridor, he would move his operations to the remote fire roads of the Santa Cruz Mountains. If he knew they were looking for a specific type of weapon, he would change his methods. The police were essentially coaching their own suspect on how to evade them. They were feeding the wolf the coordinates of the sheep, completely oblivious to the fact that the man nodding sympathetically at their failures was the architect of their misery. This intel extended his killing spree by months, costing more lives simply because Big Ed was such a nice guy. While Kemper enjoyed his cat-and-mouse game with the police, the true source of his rage was closer to home. The killing of college students was, in Kemper's own twisted logic, merely a rehearsal. They were surrogates. The real target, the source of his hatred and his psychosis, was his mother, Clarnell Strandberg. She was a domineering, abusive figure who constantly belittled him, mocking his lack of success and his failure to find a woman. In April 1973, the game reached its horrifying conclusion. The thrill of fooling the police was waning, and the pressure inside Kemper's mind was reaching its limit. On a quiet morning, as his mother slept, Kemper entered her room and ended her life. He then murdered her friend Sally Hallett to cover his tracks. This was the finale he had been building toward. But unlike the co-ed murders, there was no sexual gratification, only a grim sense of finality. With his mother dead, the primary engine of his rage was gone. The monster suddenly found himself without a purpose. He had won his twisted war against her, and he had won his game against the police. He sat in that house, surrounded by death, and realized he had nowhere left to go. The friendly giant had committed the ultimate sin, and the mask was finally ready to slip. After the murder of his mother, Kemper did not go to the bar. He didn't taunt the police. He simply got in his car and drove. He headed east, fleeing California, driving through the vast, empty landscapes of Nevada and Utah, eventually crossing into Colorado. He had enough guns and ammunition in his car to start a small war. He listened to the radio, waiting for the news bulletin. He waited to hear that the Santa Cruz Police had broken down his door, found the bodies, and launched a nationwide manhunt for Big Ed. He drove for hundreds of miles, waiting for the sirens, but the radio remained silent. There were no bulletins, no manhunt. Back in Santa Cruz, nobody suspected a thing. His mother's house was quiet. The detectives at the jury room were likely wondering where their friend Ed was, perhaps assuming he was down with the flu or on a road trip. This silence broke him. It was the final insult. He had committed the most heinous crimes imaginable, culminating in matricide, and still, nobody noticed. The invisibility that had protected him for so long now felt like a curse. He was alone in Pueblo, Colorado, exhausted, out of money, and realizing that the only way the world would ever know what he had done was if he told them himself. On April 20th, 1973, Edmund Kemper stepped into a phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado. He dropped a handful of coins into the slot and dialed the Santa Cruz Police Department. He was ready to give up. He was ready to reveal the monster behind the mask. When the dispatcher answered, Kemper identified himself. He confessed to the murder of his mother. He confessed to the murders of the college students. He laid it all out. And then, the most unbelievable thing happened. The police didn't believe him. The officer on the other end recognized his voice. "Ed, is that you?" They thought it was a prank. They thought Big Ed from the bar was drunk again, playing a sick joke. The rapport he had built was so strong. The image of the friendly giant so ingrained in their minds that they psychologically could not accept him as a killer. Kemper had to argue with them. He had to plead to be arrested. He had to provide specific gruesome details about the crime scenes, details that had never been released to the public, just to convince them to take him seriously. He eventually hung up and called back, speaking to a different officer, practically begging them to send someone to pick him up. It remains one of the most bizarre moments in criminal history. A serial killer struggling to convince the police that he is, in fact, the bad guy. When the Santa Cruz police finally verified Kemper's confession, the department went into a state of shock. The detectives who had shared beers with him, who had accepted his donuts and confided in him, were physically ill. The betrayal was absolute. They hadn't just failed to catch the killer. They had befriended him. They had invited him into their sanctuary. The realization that they had unknowingly protected the man slaughtering their community caused deep psychological scars for many of the officers involved. Edmund Kemper was sentenced to life imprisonment. He is still alive today, residing in the California medical facility. In a strange twist, he became a model prisoner, using his voice, the same soft-spoken voice that disarmed detectives to record hundreds of audiobooks for the blind. The story of Edmund Kemper serves as a chilling reminder of the fallibility of perception. We are taught to fear the shadows, the outliers, the people who look dangerous. But Kemper taught us that sometimes the monster isn't lurking in the bushes. Sometimes he is the polite man buying the next round of drinks, laughing at your jokes, and waiting patiently for his turn. The bar where Edmund Kemper drank with detectives is long gone, lost to time like the secrets it once held. But the lesson of the friendly giant remains. We comfort ourselves with the idea that evil is ugly, that we will recognize the wolf by his teeth. But history tells us a different story. Sometimes, the wolf doesn't bare his teeth. Sometimes, he smiles. He buys you a drink. He listens to your problems. And he waits. If you found this deep dive into the psychology of Edmund Kemper compelling, please hit the like button. It helps these stories reach more people. And if you want to join us for the next investigation into the darkest corners of history, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Sleep well, and be careful who you let into your circle. I'll see you in the next one.